July 4th, 1826. I want you to just picture the scene for a moment because it is arguably the most cinematic, the most unbelievable moment in American history.
It really is. It's the kind of thing that if you wrote it in a script, people would say it's too much.
Exactly. The nation is turning 50. It's the Golden Jubilee. You've got parades in Philadelphia, cannon fire echoing through Boston, speeches in, every town square from the coast to the frontier.
And amidst all that celebration, this profound silence is falling over two very specific, very important households.
On that exact day, the 50th anniversary of the signing of the Declaration of Independence, the two men who were, the intellectual engines of that independence, they both take their final breaths.
Thomas Jefferson and John Adams.
And these weren't just colleagues. They'd been best friends during the Revolution. Then they became these bitter, bitter political rivals who wouldn't speak for more than a decade.
And then friends again. Pen pals in their old age, trying to make sense of it all. It's just an incredible story arc.
And the final line of that story. I've always found Adams's last words to be the ultimate historical irony.
Thomas Jefferson survives. He whispered it on his deathbed up in Massachusetts.
Right. And he had absolutely no idea that his old friend and rival, Jefferson, had actually passed away just a few hours earlier down in Virginia at Monticello.
It's an ending that's it's too perfect. But it happened.
And that's our starting point today. We are not just looking at the myth or the coincidence or the marble statue in Washington. We're opening a massive dossier on the man Adams thought had survived him.
We're looking at Thomas Jefferson.
And looking at this stack of sources you've brought in, I see biographies, plantation records, his own architectural notes, private letters. This feels less like a simple biography and more like an investigation.
It has to be an investigation.
Yeah.
You really can't understand the United States without grappling with Thomas Jefferson. He's often called the man of the people or the sage of Monticello.
Sure, those are the textbook phrases.
Right. But when you actually read the primary sources, not the summaries, but his private notes, the accounts of the people who lived and worked with him, both free and enslaved, he emerges as, perhaps the most complex, contradictory, and just frustratingly brilliant figure in American history.
And that's our mission for this deep dive. We need to move beyond those bullet points. We need to try and understand how the same man who wrote the words, "All men are created equal," could have owned over 600 human beings in his lifetime.
And how the great champion of small, limited government could unilaterally double the size of the entire country with a single signature.
And the one that always, always gets me.
Yep.
Why, after being president of the United States for 2 terms, he specifically ordered that it not be mentioned on his tombstone.
It's a huge question. What does that say about how he viewed his own life?
So let's rewind. To understand the sage, we have to start at the beginning. We picture him as this, elderly statesman, but his origins are very different.
Very different. To get Jefferson, you have to understand the Virginia frontier of the 1740s. He was born in 1743 at a place called Shadwell. This wasn't Philadelphia or Boston. This was, for all intents and purposes, the edge of the map.
And his father, Peter Jefferson, he wasn't some kind of philosopher king, was he?
Not at all. The sources describe him as a surveyor and a planter, a man of, quote, immense physical strength and sound judgment. He was a man of the land.
A rugged outdoorsman type.
Exactly. And Thomas, by all accounts, worshipped him. But then Peter dies when Thomas is only 14.
Wow. 14. That puts a teenager in an incredibly difficult position.
It forced him to grow up instantly. At 14, he becomes the man of the house. He inherits the land, he inherits his father's debts, and crucially, he inherits the enslaved people on the plantation.
So he's managing a plantation before he's even really an adult?
Yes. But there's another event, a specific trauma in his early adulthood, that I think explains his psychology even more than his inheritance.
You're talking about the fire at Shadwell.
The fire of 1770. This wasn't just losing a house. For a mind like Jefferson's, it was like losing a part of himself. The family home burned to the ground. And in the fire, he lost his first library.
How many books?
About 400 volumes, which is a huge library for the time. And almost all of his early writings and legal papers were gone too. Just smoke.
And for a man who later famously said, "I cannot live without books," that must have been just devastating.
It was a shattering loss. And many historians argue this event is the key to his obsessive-compulsive record-keeping later in life. From that point on, Jefferson documented everything.
Everything.
I mean everything. He counted the nails used in construction. He recorded the temperature and wind direction multiple times a day. He logged every cent he spent. It's almost like he believed that if he could just quantify the world, he could control it, and he would never be surprised by that kind of chaos again.
And that need for control, it manifests physically in the place we all associate with him, Monticello. We think of it as this, pretty house on the back of the nickel.
But it wasn't just a house. It was never just a house. Monticello means little mountain in Italian. He started building it in 1769, and he basically never stopped tinkering with it for the rest of his life.
Constantly renovating.
Constantly. Tearing down walls, adding wings. It was his autobiography in brick and mortar. And if you walked inside, the entrance hall, wasn't the typical fancy receiving room. You were walking into a museum.
A museum of the Enlightenment, the sources list maps, Native American artifacts, and my personal favorite detail, mastodon bones.
He was obsessed with mastodons. He was completely convinced they were still roaming around in the American West.
We have to come back to why that was so important to him. But the gadgets, too. The great clock that used cannonballs as weights to tell the day of the week.
Or the weather vane on the roof that was connected to a dial on the ceiling inside, so he could check the wind direction without even leaving his study.
It really sounds less like a plantation home and more like a laboratory. Or a mad scientist's headquarters.
Or just the home of a man trying to quantify and understand the world around him. His daily routine was absolute clockwork. He rose with the sun. Every single morning for 60 years, we're told he soaked his feet in a basin of cold water.
Why on earth did he do that?
He was convinced it warded off illness. It was a form of self-experimentation. He was treating his own body like another data point in his great experiment.
So you have this obsessive, data-driven man, and yet, amidst all the cold facts and mastodon bones, there was a very deep romantic streak. We have to talk about his wife, Martha.
Martha Wales Skelton. They married in 1772. And, the common image of Jefferson is that he was a bit cold, a bit aloof, almost a statue himself.
Right, not a passionate guy.
But the letters and accounts from their time together suggest he was deeply in love. And their bond, interestingly, wasn't about politics or farming. It was about music.
Which is such a lovely image. The future president playing his violin, his wife playing the pianoforte.
It is. But their marriage also highlights the grim reality of life in the 18th century, even for the wealthy. In 10 years of marriage, they had 6 children.
And only 2 survived to adulthood.
Only 2. Martha, who they called Patsy, and Mary, who they called Polly. The infant mortality rate was just relentless. And the physical strain of those pregnancies, it broke Martha's health. She died in 1782 from complications of her last childbirth. She was only 33 years old.
And there's a scene on her deathbed that is so critical. It really dictates the rest of Jefferson's personal life. It explains why there was never a First Lady Jefferson in the White House.
It's absolutely vital to understanding him. See, Martha had been raised by stepmothers, and apparently it was a terrible experience for her. She felt unwanted, pushed aside.
So as she was dying, she made Jefferson promise something.
She made him promise he would never remarry. She couldn't bear the thought of another woman raising her children.
And he kept that promise.
He did. He was a widower for the next 44 years. And the grief, the accounts are just harrowing. He was reportedly inconsolable. He paced his room for 3 weeks straight, just walking back and forth. He'd ride his horse out into the mountains until he literally collapsed from exhaustion. This wasn't some polite, formal sadness. This was a shattering event that changed him forever.
So you have this grieving, obsessive, brilliant architect on the Virginia frontier, but history is calling. The 1770s are rolling in, and the Revolution drags him out of his library and into politics.
And when he arrives at the Continental Congress in Philadelphia, he's not the star of the show. Far from it.
He was known as the silent member, wasn't he?
He was. He hated public speaking. He had a weak, kind of soft voice. He was terribly shy in large groups, and he just loathed confrontation. So while you have guys like John Adams on their feet, shouting down delegates and making these booming speeches, Jefferson is sitting in the back, quietly taking notes.
So why on earth does the committee pick the quiet guy in the back to draft the most important document in the nation's history, the Declaration of Independence?
Because of the pen. Everyone there knew he could write. He had a lyrical power and an elegance that, frankly, a passionate but blunt guy like Adams just lacked. Adams actually had to bully him into doing it.
Really? How so?
Adams's own account is fantastic. He told Jefferson, "Reason first, you are a Virginian, and a Virginian ought to appear at the head of this business. Reason second, I am obnoxious, suspected, and unpopular. You are very much otherwise."
That's incredibly self-aware. He's saying, people don't like me, but they like you.
Exactly. Adams knew that if he wrote it, people would attack the words just because they came from him. If Jefferson wrote it, the ideas might stand a chance on their own merit.
So at age 33, he sits down in a rented room in Philadelphia at a portable desk that he designed himself, of course, and drafts this monumental document.
And this is where we need to parse what he was doing. He was taking this Enlightenment concept of natural rights, the idea that your rights come from nature or God, not from a king, and he was encoding it into a political mission statement.
Life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness.
But we have to be clear. In 1776, the primary purpose of the Declaration was as a political separation letter. It was a justification for treason, really. It was turning a tax revolt into a universal philosophy.
And then we get to the sentence that defines everything. All men are created equal.
That is the friction point of American history, right there. In Jefferson's mind and in the minds of the other delegates, all men was a kind of legal term of art. It was understood not to include women. It was understood not to include Native Americans.
And it certainly did not include the hundreds of people that Jefferson himself held in bondage back at Monticello.
For certainly not. But he absolutely knew the hypocrisy of it.
How do we know that?
Because in his original draft of the Declaration, he included a long, furious paragraph blaming King George for the slave trade. He called it a cruel war against human nature itself.
So what happened to it?
The delegates from South Carolina and Georgia, and some of the New England delegates whose fortunes were tied to the slave trade, they demanded it be cut out. And Jefferson, needing consensus, he let it go. But the phrase, all men are created equal, stayed in.
And once those words were out there,
Once the ink was dry, they took on a life of their own. They became a promise, a standard. They created the very moral yardstick that we now use to measure Jefferson himself and to find him wanting.
he wrote a check that his own generation couldn't cash.
That's a perfect way to put it.
So after the Declaration, the war is on in earnest. Jefferson heads back to Virginia and serves as governor from 1779 to 1781. And the sources suggest this was, well, not his finest hour.
It was the absolute low point of his public career. It's 1781. The British Army, now led by the traitor Benedict Arnold of all people, invades Virginia. Jefferson's the governor, but he's a legislator, a philosopher, not a military commander. He was completely unprepared for an invasion.
And when the British troops march on the capital, Charlottesville, Jefferson has to flee Monticello to avoid being captured.
Right, there's the famous story of Jack Jouett's all-night ride to warn him. The Paul Revere of the South.
And he gets away just in time.
Minutes before the British dragoons arrive at his door. But the optics, as we'd say today, were just terrible. The governor of the state running for the hills while the capital is under threat.
It looks like cowardice.
And that's exactly what his political enemies called it. He was formally investigated by the Virginia legislature for negligence and cowardice.
Was he convicted?
No, he was eventually exonerated. But the accusation stung him deeply. Jefferson had incredibly thin skin when it came to his honor. He felt betrayed and humiliated, and he retreated back to Monticello, swearing he was done with public life forever.
And it's during this dark period, licking his wounds, that he writes his one and only full-length book, Notes on the State of Virginia.
Which is such a fascinating, messy, and critical text for understanding him. It lays out his entire vision for what America should be. He didn't want it to become like Europe with crowded, dirty cities and factories. He wanted a vast agrarian republic.
Farmers, he wrote, are the chosen people of God.
That's the famous quote. He believed that only independent farmers, people who own their own land and didn't depend on a boss for their livelihood, could be truly virtuous citizens. But Notes on the State of Virginia also contains his most painful and controversial writings on race and slavery, which we absolutely have to unpack in detail later.
So, feeling burned by politics, he escapes. He heads to Europe. This brings us to Section 3, Paris, Politics, and Paradoxes.
He's appointed to succeed Benjamin Franklin as the American minister to France in 1784. And just imagine the shoes he had to fill. Franklin was a global celebrity in Paris. He was the scientist, the wit, the flirt.
Right. There's that great line when someone asks Jefferson if he's there to replace Franklin.
And Jefferson gives the perfect, humble, diplomatic answer. No one can replace him, sir. I am only his successor.
So he gets to Paris, and he just falls in love with the culture, right? The architecture, the food, the wine, the bookshops.
He was soaking it all in. And he's there at this electric moment in history. He witnesses the opening stages of the French Revolution. He's actually in the room helping his friend, the Marquis de Lafayette, draft the French Declaration of the Rights of Man and of the Citizen. He's basically acting as a revolutionary consultant.
But while he's doing that, his domestic life in Paris gets very, very complicated.
It does. He brings his younger daughter, Polly, over from Virginia. And she is accompanied on the voyage by an enslaved servant named Sally Hemings.
Okay, we need to be very clear about who Sally Hemings was, relationally.
Sally Hemings was the half-sister of Jefferson's late wife, Martha. They share the same white father, the planter John Wales. So biologically, she was the aunt of Jefferson's own daughters. And contemporary descriptions suggest she bore a strong resemblance to the wife he was still grieving.
Now, here's the legal nuance that I found incredible in the research. Slavery was illegal in France at the time.
That's correct. The moment Sally Hemings stepped onto French soil, she was, in the eyes of French law, a free woman. She could have walked out of Jefferson's hotel, petitioned the French courts, and she would have been granted her freedom immediately. She had all the leverage.
So why did she go back to Virginia? Why would she agree to return to a state of enslavement?
According to the oral history passed down through generations of the Hemings family, which is now largely accepted by historians, there was a negotiation, a kind of treaty. She was a teenager, and she was pregnant with Jefferson's child.
So she used her leverage.
She did. She reportedly refused to return to America unless Jefferson made her a promise. She agreed to go back to slavery at Monticello only if he promised to free all of her future children when they turned 21.
That is an unbelievable power dynamic, an enslaved teenager negotiating the terms of her return with one of America's founding fathers.
And Jefferson agreed to her terms. This event in Paris really sets the stage for the complex, decades-long relationship that followed.
He returns to the U.S. in 1789, thinking he's going back to his quiet life at Monticello, but President Washington has other plans. He taps Jefferson to be the nation's first Secretary of State.
And this walks him right into the political buzzsaw that is Alexander Hamilton.
The great rivalry. This isn't just a simple policy disagreement. This is the fundamental conflict that has defined American politics ever since.
It really is. Hamilton and Jefferson didn't just disagree on policy. They had completely different visions for the country's soul. Hamilton, as Treasury Secretary, wanted a strong central government, a national bank, a standing army, and an economy built on industry, finance, and trade. He looked at Great Britain and saw a model of power and stability.
And Jefferson looked at Great Britain and saw a corrupt tyrant.
Exactly. Jefferson wanted power to reside with the states. He wanted a weak federal government and a nation of self-sufficient farmers. He loved the French Revolution and its ideals of radical liberty. Hamilton was horrified by it.
So the Federalists, Hamilton's party, they thought Jefferson was basically an anarchist who wanted to bring the guillotine to America.
In Jefferson's party, the Democratic Republicans, thought Hamilton was a monarchist, secretly plotting to get rid of the presidency and install a king. The rhetoric was incredibly heated.
It gets so bad that Jefferson just quits the cabinet in 1793.
He couldn't take it anymore. He felt that Hamilton always had Washington's ear. So he went home to Monticello, not to retire, but to organize the opposition. And this is a crucial part of this story. Jefferson, the quiet philosopher who hated confrontation, becomes America's first true party boss. He builds the Democratic-Republican Party from the ground up to fight Hamilton's Federalists.
Which, after a very contentious term as vice president under his now enemy John Adams, eventually works. He wins the presidency in 1800.
Which brings us to Section 4, the presidency.
He called it the Revolution of 1800, which sounds dramatic, but in a way he was right, wasn't he?
He was. It was the first time in modern Western history that power transferred peacefully from one opposing political party to another after a vicious and bitter election. That never really happened before. It was a huge test for the young republic.
And as president, he immediately changes the style, the vibe of the office. Washington and Adams had held these very formal, almost royal levees.
Right, like a European court,
right,
with strict protocol and bowing. Jefferson gets rid of all that. He famously walked to his own inauguration instead of taking a fancy carriage. He wore plain clothes.
And he introduced pell-mell seating at White House dinners.
Yes.
Yeah.
No assigned seats based on rank or importance.
Yeah.
You just sat wherever you found an open chair. First come, first served.
Which I read absolutely infuriated the British minister, Anthony Merry.
Oh, he was beside himself. He wrote these angry letters home about the lack of decorum. But Jefferson was making a very clear point. This is a republic, not a monarchy. We don't have ranks here. We are all equals around this table.
But for a guy who championed a small, weak federal government, his biggest presidential action was, well, massive. The Louisiana Purchase.
1803. This is the act that defines his presidency and shapes the future of the continent. Napoleon is fighting wars in Europe and needs cash, fast. So he makes an unbelievable offer, the entire Louisiana territory.
We're talking about the whole middle third of the continent, from the Mississippi River to the Rocky Mountains.
For $15 million, it worked out to something like 3 cents an acre.
It's the greatest real estate deal in history. But for Jefferson, it created a massive intellectual crisis.
A huge one. Because Jefferson was a strict constructionist. He believed the president and the federal government could only do what the Constitution explicitly says they can do. And the Constitution says absolutely nothing about the president having the power to buy vast territories from foreign empires.
So he's trapped by his own deeply held principles.
He was. He agonized over it. He wrote letters saying he thought he needed a constitutional amendment to make it legal. But his advisors warned him that would take way too long. And in the meantime, Napoleon might change his mind or get defeated.
So he had to make a choice.
He had to choose between his strict principles and this once-in-a-lifetime opportunity to secure the future of the nation. And in the end, he swallowed his principles. He made the deal.
He called it creating an empire of liberty.
That was his justification. He doubled the size of the nation to ensure there would be enough land for his agrarian dream to last for generations. He believed that without land, men couldn't be truly free. So he bought the land, even if he had to bend his own rules to do it.
And to find out what he had just bought, he commissions the Lewis and Clark expedition.
The core of discovery. And again, this shows you the kind of mind he had. This wasn't just a mapping expedition to claim territory. It was a scientific mission.
He gave them incredibly detailed instructions.
Oh, yeah. He told them to document the flora, the fauna, the soil types, to collect samples, to record the languages of the Native American tribes they encountered.
And of course, to look for the mastodons.
He was still hoping. He really, really hoped they'd find living mastodons or giant ground sloths. There was this theory popular among some European naturalists that everything in the New World, plants, animals, even people, was smaller and more degenerate because of the humid climate.
And that drove him crazy.
It did. It was a matter of national pride. He wanted Lewis and Clark to find a giant piece to prove the French scientists wrong.
That's amazing. Go find me a giant lion to own the French. But not all of his foreign policy was so scientific. There was also the Barbary War.
Another fascinating Jeffersonian contradiction. He hated the idea of a standing army. He distrusted a powerful navy. He wanted to rely on a mosquito fleet of small gunboats just for coastal defense.
But the Barbary pirates in North Africa from Tripoli, Algiers, they were seizing American merchant ships in the Mediterranean and holding the sailors for ransom.
Right. And for years, under Washington and Adams, the U.S. had just paid the tribute, the protection money, to keep the peace.
Jefferson refused.
He did. He famously said something to the effect of millions for defense, but not 1 cent for tribute. He sent the brand new American Navy and the Marines to the shores of Tripoli. It was America's first ever foreign war, and it was launched by a president who was, in principle, a pacifist.
You see this pattern emerging over and over. Jefferson, the president, often had to ignore the rigid rules set by Jefferson, the philosopher.
Governing is messy. It requires compromise. But his second term, that's where the compromises started to fail him.
The Embargo Act of 1807.
A complete disaster. Britain and France were at war again, and both were seizing American ships on the high seas. Jefferson was desperate to avoid being dragged into another war, so he tried what he called peaceable coercion.
He basically shut down the entire American economy. No exports at all.
He did. He thought that if he denied Europe our goods, they'd be forced to respect our neutrality. But it backfired spectacularly. It devastated the American economy, especially for merchants in New England. It led to massive smuggling operations along the Canadian border.
And to enforce it, he had to use federal power in ways that contradicted everything he stood for.
Total contradiction. Jefferson, the champion of civil liberties and small government, found himself using federal agents to conduct warrantless searches of ships and seize private property. It was a failure in every sense, and it stained the end of his presidency.
So he leaves office in 1809, and he's probably pretty relieved to get out of Washington.
He famously said he felt like a prisoner being released from his shackles. He was done.
Okay, so we've touched on this throughout, but we need to move to Section 5 and face it head on. The complicated legacy, slavery, and controversy.
This is the great, unavoidable shadow that hangs over his entire life and legacy. How does a man who wrote that all men are created equal own more than 600 human beings over the course of his life?
He wasn't ignorant of the contradiction. He called slavery a moral depravity and a hideous blot.
He did. In his private writings, he's clear that he knows it's wrong. He never made the argument that later Southern politicians would, that slavery was somehow a positive good. He knew it was an evil, but he felt trapped by it.
There's that famous quote he wrote, "We have the wolf by the ear."
And we can neither hold him nor safely let him go.
What did he mean by that?
He meant that holding on to slavery was an injustice, a sin. But he believed that if you let go, if you just abolish slavery overnight, it would lead to a bloody race war. He believed that the deep-rooted prejudices of white people and the justified grievances of black people meant the two races could never live together peacefully in a free society.
And this is where his writings and notes on the state of Virginia become so deeply problematic.
Yes. In that book, he muses on what he calls his suspicions, that black people are inferior to whites in, quote, both body and mind. He tries to frame it as a kind of scientific observation, but it's just racism. And because it came from him, the great intellectual, the sage of Monticello, it gave a kind of pseudo-scientific cover to pro-slavery arguments for decades to come.
His solution was gradual emancipation followed by colonization.
Right. He believed the only way to end slavery was to free the enslaved people and then deport them, to send them to Africa or somewhere else. That was the only way he could imagine a future without that wolf.
And yet, while holding these views, he had this intimate, long-term relationship with an enslaved woman, Sally Hemings.
The Jefferson-Hemings controversy. For more than a century and a half, most mainstream historians who were overwhelmingly white men simply dismissed the story. They said it was a political smear, that it was out of character for a man like Jefferson. They floated theories that it was one of his nephews who fathered the children.
But the rumors started during his presidency way back in 1802.
Yes, a disgruntled journalist named James Callender published the accusations, claiming Jefferson kept an enslaved concubine he called Dusky Sally.
And what does the modern evidence tell us?
Well, the game changer was in 1998. A DNA study was conducted that compared the Y chromosome of the Jefferson male line with the descendants of Eston Hemings, Sally's youngest son.
And it was a match.
It was a match. And when you combine that genetic link with all the other evidence, the oral history of the Hemings family and Jefferson's own farm records would show that he was always present at Monticello during the conception window for every single one of Sally's children, and that she never conceived when he was away. Well, the conclusion became inescapable.
So the consensus among historians now is clear.
The overwhelming consensus, yes. He fathered her 6 children, 4 of whom survived to adulthood.
And what happened to those children?
This goes back to that treaty they made in Paris. He kept his promise to her. He never formally freed Sally herself. After he died, his daughter Martha essentially gave her her time, which was an informal freedom. But he saw to it their children were freed.
How?
2 of them, Beverly and Harriet, were light-skinned enough to pass as white. When they turned 21, Jefferson allowed them to just walk away from Monticello, to run away and disappear into white society. The other 2, Madison and Eston, were formally freed in his will upon his death.
And they were the only enslaved family unit he ever freed.
Yes. Out of the hundreds of people he owned in his life, he only ever freed a tiny handful, almost all of whom were members of the Hemings family. For everyone else, he remained dependent on their forced labor to maintain his lifestyle, his books, his wine, his constant renovations, until the day he died.
It's a heavy, heavy reality. It makes that man of the people title feel very specific to only a certain kind of people.
It does. It complicates the hero worship, but it clarifies the history. You have to see the whole man, not just the parts you admire.
So after his presidency, he finally retreats to his little mountain for good, Section 6, the Sage of Monticello.
He left office in 1809 and never again left the state of Virginia. But he didn't stop working. He threw himself into one last great project, the University of Virginia.
He called it the hobby of my old age.
And it was his creation from top to bottom. He designed the campus, the famous rotunda and the lawn. He designed the curriculum, which was radical for its time. It was secular, no religious affiliation, which was unheard of. He wanted it to be built on the illimitable freedom of the human mind. He personally hired the first faculty. He would sit on his porch at Monticello and watch the construction through a telescope.
But while he was building this incredible public legacy, his private life was collapsing financially. How does a former president and major landowner go broke?
It was a perfect storm of factors. The Embargo Act had hurt his own farm income badly. He was also incredibly disastrously generous. People would just show up at Monticello admirers, politicians, old friends, and stay for weeks on end, eating his food, drinking his fine French wine. He was essentially running a free luxury hotel.
The cost of being a celebrity.
It was. But the final nail in the coffin was when he co-signed a massive loan for a friend, Wilson Carey Nicholas, who then defaulted. Jefferson was left holding the bag.
So he died in debt.
Deeply in debt. Over $100,000, which would be millions in today's money.
And the consequences of that debt are just tragic.
They're devastating. It meant that after he died, Monticello, all his furniture, all his belongings, and 130 human beings had to be sold at auction to pay his creditors. Families who had lived at Monticello for generations were broken up and sold away. It's a heartbreaking end to the story of that community.
Before that end, though, there was one last bright spot. The reconciliation with John Adams.
Yes. A mutual friend, Dr. Benjamin Rush, was horrified that these two giants of the Revolution were still estranged. In 1812, he orchestrated a reconciliation.
Rush wrote to Adams, "You and I ought not to die before we have explained ourselves to each other."
And it worked. They began writing letters. And for the next 14 years, they exchanged 158 letters. It's one of the greatest correspondences in the English language.
What did they talk about?
Everything. They argued about the revolution, about politics, about religion, about the nature of aristocracy, about their own legacies. It was two old lions looking back at the world they had helped create, trying to make sense of it all before the end.
Which brings us full circle, back to where we started, July 4th, 1826.
Jefferson had been ill for a while, and he was holding on. His last recorded words were him asking his doctor, "Is it the 4th?" When he died on that day, it truly signaled the end of the founding era.
And then, after his death, they found his instructions for his tombstone. And this, to me, is the final fascinating piece of the puzzle.
He was very, very specific. He designed it himself. He wanted a simple obelisk, and he wanted only 3 things and not one more inscribed on it. Not President of the United States, not Vice President, not Secretary of State.
So what were the 3 things he chose?
Author of the Declaration of American Independence, author of the Statute of Virginia for Religious Freedom, and father of the University of Virginia.
Why those 3? What do they have in common?
I think it's because those were things he created, things he gave to the world. An office like president is something that people give to you. It's temporary, it involves compromise, and frankly, failures like the Embargo Act.
But the Declaration, the Statute for Religious Freedom, the university...
Those were about ideas. They were his intellectual contributions to human liberty. They were about freeing the mind. And in the end, it seems that's how he wanted to be remembered. Not as a politician, but as an architect of freedom.
That's a profound distinction. It's almost like he knew his presidency was messy, but the ideals. He believed the ideals were pure.
Precisely.
So to wrap all this up, how should you assess Thomas Jefferson today?
He's the American Sphinx. He's a puzzle you have to solve to understand the country. Because he, more than anyone, designed the American mind with all of its soaring, beautiful ideals about liberty and the pursuit of happiness, and also with all of its deep, painful, and enduring flaws regarding race and hypocrisy.
He gave us the yardstick that we now use to measure him and find him wanting.
That is the perfect way to say it. He's the one who told us that all men are created equal. And it is because he wrote those words that we have the moral authority to criticize him for not living up to them.
A man of truly immense vision and, at the same time, immense contradiction.
And maybe at the end of the day, that is the most American thing about him.
What a story. If you enjoyed this deep dive into the architect of American liberty, please make sure to like this audio and subscribe to History Titans. And we really want to hear from you in the comments. Do you think Jefferson's contributions outweigh his contradictions? Or does his hypocrisy, especially on slavery, tarnish his legacy beyond repair?
It's a tough question, but it's one every generation has to ask for itself.
Share this with a friend who loves wrestling with these big historical questions. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you on the next deep dive.